Hey, welcome to the Rene podcast. So do you ever feel like screaming out in the office, on Zoom or outside the school gates, for the love of God, come on, really? Then if this is you and you're looking for an honest, fun and frank podcast on life and business, then sit back and listen to me, Rene. I'll be bringing great people on the show to talk, share and debate their life experiences and business challenges, keeping the show unpolished, but in a fun and unique British style, with sarcasm, tenacity, maybe a few swear words or tears. This podcast keeps it real, honest, raw, and removes the bullshit in the only way I know how, through authenticity and getting shit done. Think of it less like the Housewives of New York or Towie with the lipo and drama, and more like the house lives of the real world. I hope you'll take something away to be better informed, laugh, smile, or maybe even finally getting the confidence to shout, come on really. So enjoy. Hi Rene, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Rona. Really appreciate the time.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. So for the listeners, I'm delighted to welcome Rene Velasquez to the podcast, who is highly experienced in all things carbon markets, decarbonization, and has worked with environmental markets since sort of 2008. I'm sure Rene will do a much better job of his bio than I'm going to do. But through working through environmental markets with hedge funds, banks, etc., and also with a heavy focus on the aviation industry, which we're going to come and talk on a little bit more. So welcome to the podcast. Rene's joining us from Singapore. It's nice and hot over there, so he has a cool glass of water.
Exactly.
and I've got a cup of tea. So anyway, let's dive in. So Rene, please just tell the listeners a little bit about what you currently do as your role with kind of CBL right now.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Rona. I really appreciate, again, the introduction and the time. So a little bit about what I do. I work for a company called CBL Markets. We're part of a broader group called Expansive. And think of us essentially as the infrastructure providers within environmental commodity market. So what we do is effectively build the necessary infrastructure, in this case, environmental products like renewable energy certificates and carbon credits. Think of these as digital assets. And so they reside in registries. So these are essentially centralized databases. And then we build and operate and manage those registries. We also operate meta registries that connect various different siloed registry systems into one kind of aggregate or nexus, let's just say. And that helps to sort of create this single sign-on portfolio management. So it's a much more sort of structured view. And then the CBL business where I reside is an exchange. And so an exchange really is a matching engine. It matches buyers and sellers and an electronic platform. And today, CBL is the largest exchange across the environmental commodity markets on the physical side. And in terms of carbon, somewhere north of 40% of the total traded volume globally of voluntary carbon offsets is trading through CBL. So that just gives you some context. We also, so I mentioned three verticals, the registries, the meta registry, the exchange. The fourth vertical in our ecosystem is essentially a data platform. So, to help promote transparency and confidence in markets, which begets more and more liquidity, you need to have data. And so you mentioned in the introduction some of my clients, large banks, investment banks, hedge funds, financial intermediaries, let's call them, tend to rely a lot on that data. They want to have a look at the historical data set. They want to also have a look at the current, trading day. And that way, the financial intermediaries and other commodity traders, as well as other retail players and advisory firms that are transacting in this market, effectively have a level playing field. Everybody knows where the price is on a given day and at a given time for whatever given instrument. So that's just a little bit of color, but essentially I run the carbon team within CBL.
Amazing. And so I might fire some really basic, obvious questions, but this is part and parcel of what the podcast is about. But I guess a couple of things there. So you mentioned voluntary markets. So do you see that this will become regulated at some point? Do you think you'll help to move it towards regulation? What's the business views on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the answer is yes. I'll give you a little bit of color. So in carbon markets, you have compliance systems like the UK ETS and EU ETS, and you also have other systems in other jurisdictions. So we cover a few of those. I neglected to mention that in the introduction. So California Cap and Trade, there's a system there. And then also in the RGGI system, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is essentially a grouping of northeastern US states that essentially are trading allowances. Compliance systems tend to be focused on allowances. Essentially, these are permits that the government create, and then over time reduces the number of those allowances, thereby driving down effectively the available supply. And that creates effectively, limitation on the ability to pollute. So effectively sends a signal to the market and those covered entities, those that are under that compliance regime, to effectively be more efficient and decarbonize their operations. Those compliance systems do work also in sync, let's say, within voluntary context. So think of it this way, and I kind of tend to use the word sort of interoperability when I kind of talk about this in different fora. So under the Paris Agreement, we have this nationally determined contributions. It's essentially a pathway that countries can effectively decide how best to reduce their emissions and their decarbonization pathway. Some countries will say, okay, well, we'll create an emissions trading system, like I just mentioned, a cap and trade scheme. Others will effectively cover specific sectors or have absolute targets with regards to emission reductions. And others might choose hybrid systems. So there are a number of examples. I'll give you one. The Colombian carbon tax in Colombia, in South America, where I was born, there is a tax on fuel. So think essentially it's a fuel levy, think of it that way. And emitters, those fuel consumers and those generators of that fuel for burning that can effectively choose to either pay the tax or, in lieu of paying the tax, purchase voluntary carbon offsets, have those retired, submit those to the government, and the government says, okay, great, that equates to your footprint. And they chose route voluntary, essentially. And so you can have this interoperability. And so think of the voluntary market as essentially filling in the gaps where there is lack of coverage around compliance systems. And it allows market participants to effectively start to meet their goals now and not wait for a regulated future, right? So in that context, it's synergistic. Now, to your question around, do I think the voluntary market becomes regulated? I definitely think it will at some point in time. There are different regulators that essentially, and it already certainly is to one extent. I'll mention a partnership that we have with CME, formerly the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group, who operate a futures marketplace, right? And they do that based on our spot contracts. So we're the physical market of spot, and they operate a futures derivatives market. Because of financial derivatives, they are regulated by the CFTC, right? So that's the US regulator for commodities. And so you do have that coverage around derivatives, but not yet on the spot. I think there are a number of regulators that are looking at it and are saying, are carbon offsets treated as, should we treat them as commodities or as securities? If the prevailing consensus is that it will be treated as a commodity, and therefore spot transactions will not come under the purview of regulators. But there might be some regulators that do look at it as securities, depending on whether certain venues go down a tokenization pathway or something like that. It might trip some securities laws. And so I think that over time there will be more and more scrutiny around this. And so we wait to see. But certainly from an exchange perspective, we welcome dialogue with regulators. As an exchange, the whole purpose of an exchange is really to promote transparency and liquidity, right? And to do it in really this kind of very open format, right? Level playing field. And so the data's all there. Participants have to undergo KYC, so know your client, AML, anti-money laundering reviews. And so there's this really sort of already intrinsic kind of a regulatory kind of purview that we take upon ourselves, and then in preparation for any sort of regulated future.
Super. So when it comes to obviously the carbon credits that you're trading in, what sort of benchmarks and standards are you setting to make sure that, I guess, not only that your buyers can trust that those are valid and aren't double sold? How do you ensure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we work very, very closely with all of the major registries and standards in the market. So I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction that we are also the registry provider. Our business, the registry business, is called APX. That provides the registry services to 3 of the big 4 voluntary standards. So in carbon, you have the Verified Carbon Standard, or VERA. That's the biggest standard. You have the Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, and the Climate Action Reserve. And so APX provides the registries for VERA, CAR, and ACR, so Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry. And so that's three of the big four. We work very closely also with the gold standard, right? And we integrate and operate their registries and integrate it with our systems, I should say. The kind of avoidance of double counting is done by sharing effectively of information and also creating flags within the registry to demonstrate effectively that you're tracing these claims. There's a potential under the Paris Agreement for double counting that's obviously needs to be avoided, right? Where a country can effectively make a claim around certain emission reductions within their borders. And we want to avoid the situation where a project is also making that same claim. So the registries are working very closely with host countries as well. And there's an initiative called the Climate Warehouse, which is a World Bank initiative. It essentially is a meta registry that was sort of a data layer that sits on top. And so it's that knowledge sharing around what project was registered, that it was ensured that it was only registered in one place, that when those units were created, that then obviously they can be transacted and then they can be retired. So they can only be retired or surrendered one time. And that's facilitated because everything's, again, it's a digital asset, so it's serialized. And we can denote certain attributes. You talk sort of intimating around quality as well. You can define certain attributes, whether a carbon offset is a reduction or a removal type of offset. You can talk about the different methodologies. You can talk about whether it's eligible for various different standardized contracts as well. And so those attributes all reside in the registry systems that we operate. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a couple of things that kind of spring to mind, a couple of things I'd like to touch on if you wouldn't mind. One is your view on how the pricing has gone over the last decade. And what that's kind of resembling, and then also touching on how you manage the failure of carbon credits. So where you have a forest fire or something disastrous happens to that, how do you plan that into the risk for your clients, for anyone who is offsetting?
Yeah, so let's address the second component, right? That really is the purview of the standards themselves. But in the design of any protocol or any methodology, the standards themselves, and as it relates to nature-based projects of forestry, where there is potentially a risk of deforestation, degradation, or some adverse event like fire, the way that the standards operate is that essentially, they monitor and verify annually all of the emissions that are captured under that project activity, and they also just effectively create a buffer. So that there's a buffer pool. So they don't actually issue all of the emission reductions that the project generates on an annual basis. They actually hold back, effectively this buffer pool for these types of adverse events, right? And so if there is a fire in that region, well, then at the next issuance, effectively they're depleting into that buffer, and they're not going to have any issuance in that next cycle. To be honest, those are much more limited in terms of the outcomes and sort of numbers of projects that have kind of gone to that end are fairly limited. And so, the standards is one of the gatekeepers. There are some emerging sort of interesting areas in this space around insurance for sort of these types of outliers, types of events. And so that's a sort of a growing topic at the moment, but it is still in its infancy. So, they're essentially an answer. That's a purview of the standards, but there are protocols to kind of help protect against those sorts of things. Now, to the first part of your question around the kind of the pricing and how the market has transformed over the 10 years, I think it's a tale of two stories, essentially. Looking back a decade ago, we were just coming out of essentially the global financial crisis, right? We were just kind of 2012, like a few years on, the world's recovering. Ambition is not as significant as it is today with regard to net zero and decarbonization broadly, because effectively the focus of most policymakers was on economic recovery, right? And so, as opposed to now, we've got increasing rates, there was just decreasing rates, right? And so the quantitative easing kind of approach. At the time, because of the lack of demand, because of the lack of ambition, and quite frankly also the fact that there was oversupply from the Clean Development Mechanism, a UN framework under the Kyoto Protocol, essentially the market was oversupplied and underdemanded. So naturally, what's going to happen is that prices come down, and they effectively traded very, very low for a very long time. we started to see a transformation in the market sort of following the Paris Agreement, with sort of increasing ambitions being set at the corporate level around effectively carbon neutrality, and then what's morphed into a broader kind of context around achieving net zero. That really started to gain pace in 2019. And so we started to see the market transform. Effectively, prices starting to come up as demand came on. There was a realization that if commitments continued at a rapid rate, which they actually did throughout the pandemic, that there effectively will be an inversion in the marketplace, that around much more demand than there actually is currently supply. But markets tend to oscillate like this, right? So as the demand starts to pick up pace, then supply will also, in theory, pick up pace, right? Depending on some bottlenecks and stuff. But what we saw in the pandemic, where effectively so much of our lives was upended, right? Was this kind of doubling down on the climate issues and the commitments and reaffirmations of achieving net zero. And that created really significant tailwinds for this market. And so kind of just coming back to the story, essentially the last few years have seen this really significant growth in liquidity. And as that liquidity has increased, there has been some volatility with regards to pricing, but effectively prices have come up pretty strongly. We saw an 800% increase in pricing from the beginning of last year, or let's say October 2020, through to sort of the beginning of this year, for certain instruments that we track on our platform. So it's pretty significant growth. Carbon in general was one of the outperforming sectors globally last year. Now, obviously, with the downturn, following the Ukrainian, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I should say, obviously asset prices have taken a hit across a number of different asset classes, whether they be bonds or equities, and carbon's no different to that. And there's been a significant increase in volatility, but they've actually held up pretty well. So yeah.
Amazing. And so, head spinning. So, what do you say? What's someone going to pay on average now for a ton of?
Yeah, good question. So, so there's obviously different, let's call them baskets, right? And so, if you're looking at the nature-based side, we have a standardized contract called the N-GEO, the Nature-Based Global Emissions Offset. And this is a standardized contract that is traded not only on CBL, but also on CME on the futures. And so that currently is sitting around the sort of the $13 to $14 range on the futures. Let's say December 23. I'm actually trying to load it up here. Apologies. And so you're looking certainly above this $12 range, right? And then on the GEO, effectively compliance units for the airline industry, looking somewhere in this $4 to $5 range. And so there are discounts depending on effectively the project types. And typically the market tends to value the nature-based projects much more than renewables projects because of not only the emission reduction potential and the kind of correlation to protecting native forests, but also because of the impacts that go beyond just the carbon sequestration piece, right? They're actually, as one of the core criteria of the N-GEO contract, we require that all units that are deliverable into that must have the CCB certification, so climate, community, and biodiversity certification. So it's an additional hurdle, essentially, that projects must overcome to demonstrate those impacts with regards to communities and the biodiversity as well. So obviously, it's kind of awareness and demand has increased. How much of the world is left to really pull into the market of carbon? And do you deal in blue carbon, or is that something that's not? Yeah. Look, so there are really some exciting areas, like, for example, blue carbon is the term that we use for nature-based projects that are related to mangroves, right? So the restoration and the planting of mangroves, which are really important ecosystems. Many of those methodologies for those projects are effectively very new. So yes, we do have blue carbon projects being traded on our platform. We'll have some announcements actually in the coming weeks around some first transactions for some pretty high some profile projects. But they're few and far between right now, just because they're in their infancy. Let's just say they're in the sort of the first round of issuances. But there is appetite for those. They do trade at a premium above where other forestry projects tend to trade because of effectively the exclusivity and the kind of the nascent kind of nature of it. But it's, on our platform, we're, as an exchange, we're agnostic. Everything that's available in the market is able to trade. And to your question around the kind of participants and who else could be kind of dragged into the market, so to speak, it's global by its very nature, and it's inclusive by its very nature. So we have clients on our platform across effectively every continent, with the exception of Antarctica, and across the entire gamut of business. Effectively, you have on the primary market end, project developers, those folks on the ground effectively developing those projects and working with those local communities, to the traditional kind of advisory and intermediaries in this market, think the South Poles, climate cares of the world, and offset retailers, the ones that work with smaller clients like SMEs and kind of retail kind of offerings online, and then the larger financial intermediaries, banks, investment banks, hedge funds, specialized carbon funds. There are a number of family offices and specialized funds that have emerged over the last few years that have really started to dedicate capital at scale to this marketplace. And then you have the large commodity trading houses, think the Mercuria, Trafigura, Vitol, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus of the world, Glencore's. And then you've got effectively consumers, right? Whether they be the large airlines, the large industrial corporates, technology companies, you name it. And so it's this ecosystem it's effectively a level playing field. It's egalitarian, it's accessible to all, and it's trading all on an electronic interface. Real time, 24/7, 365.
So as obviously we talked about, the challenge between offsetting and insetting. So offsetting can obviously sometimes get a bit of a bad name, i.e. that just promotes business as usual. But surely we're going to get to a point where if every business on the planet went, I'm going to buy carbon credits to offset, we just don't have enough to be able to do that. And so do you see a point in the markets that you have now? Because once you've sold them, and they might be bought annually every year to maintain. What do we do then? Is there a point where the intel and the insights that your industry is getting, that you're like, there's only so many carbon credits, we're going to hit a peak at this point, then what do we do?
I'm a big believer in markets, and I think if you have these types of signals, there might be a squeeze, essentially what you're getting at, around the kind of the supply. But as effectively the prices continue to go higher, as the demand naturally will increase, right? In that scenario, there are now different types of technologies that become viable. So effectively, you're going up the marginal abatement cost curve, effectively. And so as the carbon price increases, there's a signal to industry to effectively, hey, these plans that you effectively had on hold to invest, in whatever it might be, some CapEx type of investment that's decarbonizing or reducing emissions, is now financially viable. So you'll actually get this kind of influence around a broader scope. And I think sometimes media, and I kind of will point to this kind of the John Oliver story around offsets, and he hit some very important points. Like, we can't offset our way out of climate change. That's not what the market is about. Essentially, it is a tool in this arsenal, right? So you look at the decarbonization hierarchy. Essentially, you have to measure, reduce, and ultimately then offset, right? You have to seek out efficiencies. But by having a price signal around what your emissions are, that's the strongest signal that you can send within a business and an organization towards thinking and innovating and deploying capital to where it can actually make an impact. Because otherwise, it just becomes rhetoric, right? Yeah. So carbon offsets sometimes get a bad rap. And I'm not saying that all carbon credits are absolutely perfect. As an industry, we're taking this very introspective view at the moment with the Integrity Council on voluntary carbon markets effectively leading the way. This is the Mark Carney-led initiative. And essentially, that's to define quality and essentially set up a North Star for the industry so that we can have better and better and better projects over time, right? And that will obviously have an impact in terms of the pricing, as I mentioned earlier. But yeah, it's in sync with regards to the broader kind of efficiency pathways that companies have to take. And so, we will certainly advocate to all clients that are accessing the market what they ought to be doing. But again, as an exchange, we're an exchange or a marketplace where they can transact. Yeah.
So when I think of, the purchase of carbon credits, and I do for my family and my business, I actually buy them through Wildlife Works. It's a Red Plus program, and so there is an absolute place for them, because I can't, and I over purchase, so I'm actually in a carbon positive position. So I think they can have a bad rap, but I think it's part of a solution that needs, as we work on our insetting. But the very nature of a lot of these projects are obviously in developing countries or places with unique natural ecosystems.
Absolutely.
Do you think and believe that as we are buying and you are trading, that investment is really going into the people and the nature and the ecosystems that deserve it? My fear is it becomes, something that's traded, and it's people like, you and I who can afford to buy them, or, trade in them, that benefit financially, and not the actual location.
It's a great question. And so the answer is absolutely. I do know for a fact where the carbon finance is going. I've actually seen it on the ground. So you mentioned the Wildlife Works organization. They're a wonderful project developer with projects across, predominantly Africa, but now also expanding into Asia and Latin America through some partnerships, but also through their own investment. I had the privilege of going to the Kasagao Corridor project. It's a project that Wildlife Works operates and protects in Kenya. And I actually went to Rukinga, to the communities a number of years ago, to actually visit and see that project for myself with my own eyes. And, this was sort of circa 2017. So the market prices were still very, very low. And the communities were generating revenue from the sale of those offsets, but it was effectively break even, right? There was a little bit more than that. There was sort of cash flow positive, let's just say, but just barely. But as the prices have increased, I can tell you firsthand that those projects have actually seen significant revenue income streams and enable that developer to effectively expand and increase their ambition. So now they're looking at protecting other native habitats, right? And so that project in particular is really interesting because it's a corridor, as the name suggests. It's for big game effectively in Africa, right? So you have elephants and all these sorts of wonderful animals, giraffes, etc., that can actually cross from north to south effectively through this protected native corridor, as opposed to being deforested from the kind of increasing pressure from communities in that part of the world. And so, we can now actually see that finance flowing. It also works, and it comes down to transparency. And this is the kind of the crux of any marketplace, right? By having a transparent price signal, which was lacking historically. And so what I'm only really over the last few years, as we've seen this kind of transition towards exchange trading, now there is a clear and discernible price signal that's accessible to every market participant, right? Yeah. So there's no free rides for anybody. Effectively, project developers can see what's the price on the screen, but their projects, they can see the project specific price or the contract price of which those units are eligible for, and they can also look out on the forward curve on the CME. Right, so they can actually see the value, intrinsic value of their projects. And so whether they're structuring deals bilaterally, so with a known counterparty via a kind of offtake agreement, or whether they're trading on exchange, effectively there's a price signal, right? And so now they know, okay, we're at 10, we're at 15, we're at whatever the price is of the day, that's the fair price. And effectively, the folks that are trading obviously are providing a very important service also to the market. What's really sort of contributed to the low prices as well, because of the lower demand for a very long time, was effectively this very primary focus market, meaning the project developer was trying to sell to the end buyer. It's a very, very lengthy sale process. Yeah. And it's very lumpy, right? And you might find a really attractive corporate client. Maybe it's an airline, maybe it's a large industrial or a technology company, but they will typically not buy the entirety of the issuance from that one project. You need to effectively find multiple clients. And so what ends up happening is this perverse outcome that the project developers have to now also spend a lot of money hiring salespeople to go out there and try to actually build those relationships. Whereas now, effectively, those financial intermediaries that I mentioned earlier, they can actually provide a liquidity event and effectively say, well, look, here's the fair market price. We can pay you for the entire issuance upfront because we have a belief that effectively the price will increase. So then now they're taking on that risk on their own balance sheet. The project developers can go back to doing what they're really good at. And effectively it is investing that money in developing new projects and continuously working with the local communities, et cetera, right? And so you get this bridge that the financial intermediaries provide. They carry that on their balance sheet. If the price goes down, they took a haircut. If the price goes up, they made money on their P&L. And so that's the way that markets work. And carbon's no different to any other, whether it's agricultural, commodity, metals, energy commodities, et cetera. But effectively, by having this price signal, now you can see what the real value is.
So if you're a community or an individual that's sat on, a considerable amount of forest land that, really you just it's always been there. It's sequestering carbon all the time. Are you in a position to pick up the phone to someone like you guys and say, come and register the land that I have, and we'll maintain the protection? Are they in a position to sell the carbon credits that already exist on their land?
Yes and no. They, as an exchange, we cannot get involved in project development or any of the effectively underlying assets. We have to remain neutral as a venue for trading of these instruments. But our clients certainly can, and the standards certainly can, right? So if the project activity in that kind of hypothetical scenario meet the key criteria of carbon offsets, which I'll just name a few, but effectively the project must be financially additional. So it must be reliant on the carbon financing in order to actually remain and operate. That's a key core tenet. There must be also focus on whether it's real, whether it's verifiable, and that gets borne out in the kind of the MRV, or the monitoring, reporting and verification process. And then ultimately that there's permanence around that project and the emission reductions or removals. So it's a fairly high hurdle for project activities to jump over. Now there's this added level with regards to the kind of the double counting issue that you mentioned earlier, and certain sectors like the land sector, effectively coming up against sort of this friction, where the host country maybe is covering that sector for their own kind of NDC commitments, and therefore restrict the number of, or the ability to export those units to a voluntary market context. So it's not necessarily linear, but there is the potential for correlation. And so, we're seeing this kind of jostling right now as certainly the jurisdictions, the host countries, let's just say, are effectively looking at this as an opportunity to one, meet their ambitions and their commitments under the Paris Agreement, but also see this as a commodity that they can actually charge a royalty on, and ultimately, if they're generating more than what they require, they can effectively export those to international corporates or to other host countries who are effectively short. And so, this is being borne out right now, but effectively, the answer is yes. If the project meets all those hurdles, they can go and work with the project developer and work with the standard, have them registered. And upon registration and the continuous kind of monitoring, once those credits are issued, then they can come to us. They can be onboarded to the exchange, and then can trade. But we can't help them to get that kind of technical implementation piece. We can certainly connect them, and we often do. This is still a relatively small market, right? It's only sort of a market cap just a little bit north of $2 billion. And that's fairly small. You can still kind of know most of the folks. And because we're in the nexus, right, as a centralized marketplace, we tend to be able to connect folks with one another, and we often do. And it's just a view that we need to pay it forward in order to grow the market.
I'm thinking there's so many people that I know that have got, kind of conservation projects or projects in the jungle or land that they're protecting that they haven't even thought about, is this an opportunity? And it's, you and I both know, protecting, virgin rainforest or jungle or whatever, land is the best thing to do. Secondly, to restore and then obviously rebuild or replant. So
absolutely.
There's an opportunity there that I think that people could, if the task isn't too arduous and it doesn't cost them a ridiculous amount of money to get registered and verified, they're sitting on prime carbon credit land to earn an income. So I just think it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, in principle, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Right. You hit a really important point, which was the kind of the accessibility to the market, right? And so historically, and this is something that I think will be addressed over the next few years, small landowners have actually been, in a large part, excluded from participating in the carbon market because of that very point of monitoring and effectively drawing the border around where these plots of land are and the ultimate yield of those offsets at whatever X price. Yeah. Don't even begin to cover the actual registration and the monitoring verification fees, right? So there's effectively this sunk cost. So there are a number of projects in Guatemala. Another project that I went to visit in Conservation Coast in Guatemala. Effectively, they grouped hundreds of different landowners' plots and effectively created this. They call them polygons, but effectively on the map, they just, they block out where all this land is protected.
Yeah.
And it's this incredibly biodiverse region where effectively this incredible amount of bird species effectively migrate north, south, America effectively, and they transition through this part. And so, that project developer was able to work over many, many years and effectively working with those local stakeholders to develop that project. But that's a labor of love, right? That's one that's really, really onerous. And so I think the carbon markets and the standards are certainly looking at this area around how to be more inclusive and maybe looking at technologies that can actually help project developers effectively gain access into this market, because I think you're absolutely right. We want to engage as many folks as possible, and we want to create the right incentives from a financial perspective that, hey, your land is more valuable by being protected and effectively retaining the biodiversity and effectively the carbon stock within it, rather than cutting it down. And so, I think we need to do a better job of making it inclusive.
But of course, I think, the elephant in the room, when you look at, agriculture, logging and drugs, those are three major markets that just will always pay more. And so it's very easy for us in a Western comfortable, bungalow in a village or beautiful apartment in Singapore. Mm-hmm. Those tensions naturally make that quite complex.
Absolutely. And hence why the price signal is really important, right? As the price becomes more significant, now there's much more of an incentive for that protection, right?
Exactly.
And that's the value of the market. And that's why, in this kind of hierarchy that I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of folks that are advocating for a kind of rethinking of it. Instead of just a measure, reduce, offset, effectively making it cyclical and then putting the offset at the beginning. So offset, then measure, reduce, and offset, and just continue that cycle. So it becomes this annual repeated activity. And by having that, you effectively create a real intrinsic price on the emissions within your operations or your business. And that way you actually have now an incentive to also reduce those costs, right? Yeah.
And I think that's what is ultimately going to make blue carbon extremely challenging. No one mm-hmm. owns the oceans as such. And so I guess one for another day, that conversation. But one of the things I did want to chat to you about was obviously the work that you're doing around the aviation sector. So obviously recently there was some, kind of guerrilla style marketing against the airlines and, kind of slagging them off for, mm-hmm. Carbon. And I wasn't sat on the fence, but I just thought, what, right now there isn't at scale a alternative. There is some work in hydrogen and electric capabilities. And I think you'll correct me, but I think it's about 2 to 3% of all emissions is airlines. So actually, when it comes to who do we go after, they're important, they're huge. I don't believe we'll stop people from flying and traveling. But I think they obviously got a bit of a bad rap. And the irony of it is that most of those planes are taking people to sit in nature or by the oceans because that's mm-hmm. where their happy place is. So how have you been working with that kind of emissions trading, and are you seeing a shift, with EasyJet making that pull out and will more go that way? What's your view on all of that?
Yeah, great. Lots to unpack there. Let me try to answer them in sequence if I can remember all the questions. So I've been very fortunate to work with a number of airlines and with the industry at large for now close to 7 years. Started in early 2015. We were very fortunate that we already had clients in that space, and effectively we learned by doing. But effectively, the market, the actual industry itself, has done some really amazing things. It's the first industry sector globally to effectively create its own system for decarbonization, right? A global unified view and commitment to decarbonization. And why did they do that? Because effectively, like you said, it's a significant source of emissions. It's equivalent to 2 to 3% of total global emissions is a result of international aviation. So that's one, right? It's the size. Two, the difficulty with which to reduce the emissions that are associated with aviation. You touched on some of those in terms of technology, and I'll kind of go into that in a bit more detail. And then also just because it's cross-border, it's not easy to cover, right? You effectively have, and you had this potential before the scheme that's currently in place now, that's known as CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, came into effect in 2000 and was effectively ratified in 2016 and came into effect in 2020. And effectively, they had the potential for a patchwork quilt of different regulations. And that's really onerous, right? I mean, you're then having a system in Japan, one in Latin America, and one in the United States, one in Europe, and you end up having to figure out effectively where you're flying to and calculating all these different things, and you've got buy allowances here and offsets there and pay taxes here. It was just really, really difficult. And so the industry recognized that, and they said, okay, we're actually going to take the front foot and effectively lead here and effectively create this system. So let me tell you a little bit about CORSIA. And it's a notoriously difficult to decarbonize sector, right? I'll begin with that. And that's what really drew me to it, because effectively it's one of the bigger problems, and how do we actually address those bigger problems? Because road transportation, it's fairly easy to decarbonize, right? We effectively need to shift away from fossil fuels, so gasoline, diesel, etc. And you can do that through electrification. It's fairly simple because you can actually put the drivetrain and batteries in cars, and you can see that now with the number of EVs that are on the road. And you can also replace the infrastructure and all that sort of stuff. But for planes, it's a lot more difficult, because planes effectively, you're having to take off, so you have to have lift, right? And then ultimately the propulsion to carry you that distance as well, right? And then there's just these metal tubes with wings on them, right? And then we all sit in there and we watch our movies, etc. Ultimately, the fuel has to have this significant fuel density. So that's what jet fuel does, right? And it's a liquid fossil-based fuel. And so the industry effectively has laid out a pathway and have got 4 core pillars that they actually rely on in order to decarbonize. The first is a technological efficiency. So think of newer planes, lighter planes, effectively dropping weight essentially. So things like the brakes, different composition of the actual fuselage, etc. You can also have winglets and other kind of more aerodynamic components. So it's just technologically as the planes become more efficient over time. The second is operational efficiency. So think about better scheduling, right? So instead of the plane being effectively idle on the ground and burning fuel, right, and not taking off, or circling in the air and taxiing effectively whilst they're trying to get them a place on the actual tarmac. So that's one. So radar systems efficiency, that way you can have electric taxiing. So effectively, instead of the planes turning on their turbines and effectively burning jet fuel from move from point A to point B on the ground, they can use e-taxis that move them out close to the takeoff runway, right? So think of that. And then effectively the third pillar, which is really where the industry is spending a lot of money and really putting significant effort into this space, is the sustainable aviation fuel. So effectively replacing the jet fuel that's coming from fossil fuel kind of origins, and actually utilizing essentially renewable fuels. So it could come from biological sources, it could come from landfill gas and waste and gas that's converted effectively into fuels. You could have it coming from algae, and there's all this technological kind of innovation that's ongoing there. And it's a really exciting space, but it is nascent, and it's going to take ultimately decades to yield the sufficient quantity that is required to effectively replace the current fuel structure, right? And then ultimately the fourth pillar is the carbon piece. So like what ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, has done is to effectively conduct its own external review of current voluntary carbon standards, measure them up against their own criteria, and evaluate them and say, okay, these are high quality and high integrity, and we'll admit units that come from these standards that meet these specialized criteria. And so they sent a signal to the marketplace saying, hey, this is the line in the sand. Everything above that is in, and everything below that is not. And so that the inclusion of offsets enables airlines to effectively purchase them to reduce their current emissions, and over time invest more and more money on the sustainable aviation fuel piece, right? And it's going to be effectively leaders. And so different airlines now have the choice in terms of how they act. You mentioned Ryanair effectively having, purchased carbon offsets and effectively now changing their mindset and essentially saying that they'll go down this sustainable aviation fuel route. United Airlines has said the same thing. The United Airlines CEO, Scott Kirby, is not a fan of offsets, and he's effectively decreed that his airline will do it the hard way and are investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on sustainable aviation fuel. And that's a very difficult approach. And then there are other airlines that are effectively embracing both and saying, well, why not do both? And effectively, we can utilize offsets today to meet our commitments. We will have and apply strict criteria and have really lengthy and well-developed due diligence around the types of offset projects that we seek and we support and we purchase and retire. And then ultimately also invest in sustainable aviation fuels, right? And then there might be other airlines that just purchase offset, right?
Yeah.
But effectively, these are tools. And I don't think we can be prescriptive. I don't think that we can make one generalization to say, hey, this is the perfect way. It doesn't apply. It ultimately, you need to do all of those things. You need to be more technologically efficient. You need to be operationally more efficient. You need to have sustainable aviation fuels come to scale. And you need to have offsets. And if you can do all of those things, then you can, over time, you can decarbonize a very hard to abate sector. And then the technological piece, like you said, the hydrogen and potentially electrical, these technologies are not yet proven for large transit, especially long haul flights. It's not yet proven.
No, and I'm not sure I want to get on that first hydrogen flight to Australia. But anyway, do you just being facetious there, but do you see though that, in my mind, if all the airlines got together and jointly invested in alternative fuel solutions, are they playing that game together, or are they all doing their own thing? Are you seeing that collaboration?
We obviously look. I've been privy to a lot of conversations. What I can tell you is that there is this incredibly collaborative environment. It's an incredibly competitive landscape, I should say. I mean, airlines it's a cutthroat business, but when it comes to sustainability and decarbonization, there's an incredible amount of collaboration. I don't want to say names, but I know of large carriers that the head of sustainability is friends with another head of sustainability, very close friend from another competing airline, and they share knowledge. And they will obviously say, hey, we're talking to these people, we're buying this, SAF or whatever it might be. And you'll actually see this kind of, sometimes both airlines structuring deals with those fuel providers, because it's not only ultimately, a handful of them benefit. But it's ultimately benefiting their entire industry. And so I think, it's fair to say that the larger airlines are taking a leadership position because they have the ability, they have the scope, and they also have larger balance sheets that they can actually now deploy. It is still not the most profitable business in the world, airlines. It's a notoriously, like I said, cutthroat business with very low margins, really large capex. And let's not forget, in the last 2 years, that industry was effectively grounded, right? And so many business models were tested, and effectively we saw, huge amount of people being furloughed or laid off. Some airlines went bankrupt. Some airlines were propped up by their state governments, etc. It's they're coming back from a very, very difficult time in their history. I think, in terms of the kind of effect on the total number of flights, I think the only parallel that some of the industry peers that I speak to can point to is the Second World War, effectively, right? Because we had so much of passenger traffic effectively shut down for 2 years almost, right?
No, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm sure we could talk about this more. I'd love to delve more into, sort of blue carbon and the fairness of the system and stuff. But listen, I think it's been amazing to talk to you about, just understand a little bit more about the markets, how you might get involved, what's happening with pricing and, the aviation. I think, maybe there's a trick here that they're missing. They're not talking enough about some of that collaborative work and some of the, the 4 pillars that you mentioned. I think there are so many markets out there that are low margin, highly competitive, but when you pull together, it will only benefit themselves and the consumers. So
absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I think you're absolutely right. I think from a PR perspective, the airline industry could be more active, but then obviously it's a highly regulated market. They're very risk averse, so they don't like sticking their necks out necessarily. So they tend to do this on the quiet, effectively, and leave either the ICAO or IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which is the membership organization for airlines, to effectively do the talking. They don't want, and this is a broad generalization, but essentially the IATA and the airlines that they represent essentially are very cautious around greenwashing. So they don't want to make claims that they can't substantiate. So that's a really key area, and I think that's really good for doing that. But I think that when you look at some of the leaders in this space, whether it's United or Delta, for example, there's two airlines that stick out in my mind that have invested billions of dollars over and committed billions of dollars over a long period of time with regards to investing into sustainable aviation fuels, KLM, Air France, BA. There's a number of other airlines that have gone into this area. I think those results will be borne out in the next decade or so, right? And then we also need policymakers to step up and make that kind of industry much more viable by creating certain incentives around investment, tax deductions, etc. And we see that in the United States with the IRA, the recent bill that was passed in the United States. It's got to focus on this type of space. So ultimately, there's no one silver bullet. It's everybody has to contribute, right? Industry, social, like the community at large, and then policymakers, and ultimately we have to drive the ambition high.
I think you summarise it well there. I think at the end of the day, we need regulation and we need incentives. But most importantly, the biggest thing that I wish to encourage either my clients or the people listening is don't avoid putting your head above the parapet, because everybody who's squirreling away in the back, actually, if you all came out and go, well, we're going to try this. Okay, this failed. Here's the report. This is what worked. This is what didn't. That sharing of that knowledge and data is so critical to drive scale and change. So I just hope that more people will brave putting their head out there, and for the fear of a bit of LinkedIn, social media, or the press, who often are not educated in this space or have a holistic view. When they look at it from just one eye lens, that one silver bullet, because that just won't work for the world.
No, it won't. It won't work, and that's not what the carbon offset market is offering. It's essentially saying, hey, here's a really eloquent tool around being able to price emissions accurately, and now create this incentive towards decarbonization. We want to go effectively out of business. We want to make sure that there is no need for offset, and ultimately that's what the driver is. It's also to deploy capital to where it can make a significant impact. You were talking about, obviously, the communities on the ground. And there is this pathway via the purchase of really high quality offsets. And so, it'll be an interesting space to sort of keep an eye on. Certainly, it's not perfect, but it's, like in any space, like you said, it's iterative. You don't want to let the perfect get in the way of the good. You want to ultimately raise ambition annually and over time in order to get better and better and better.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, thank you so much, Rene. And for the listeners, God love you. You have you would never have known it, but obviously Rene's still struggling with COVID. So how you got through the last 50 minutes, I don't know. But congratulations, you did absolutely sterling job. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you're back on form very soon.
Thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
So that's it. You've made it. The show's over. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've been able to take something away, maybe solve a problem, or just know you're not alone. Here's hoping it made you smile with a few laughs along the way. Please feel free to find me on all social media channels, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search the Rene Podcast. Have an awesome day, and see you next time.